We're excited to introduce to you Shawnnah Monterrey. She is the CEO and founder of BeanStock Ventures. So Shawnnah brings expertise in global product development and software management, particularly in the area of medical instruments and diagnosis. And BeanStock Ventures is a pioneering medical device development company and FDA accredited 510K review organization. So she'll be speaking to us about the key to MedTech startup success and investor confidence. Thank you so much.
Good afternoon, everyone. I heard there was a talk earlier about the regulatory landscape, so I hope this isn't a repeat. But if it is, just know that this area is a little bit complex, much like IP. So it doesn't hurt to learn a little bit more. So I wanted to kind of set the tone here in terms of expectations on time for approval. About 31 months on average. This information is a little bit dated. I think some people have been able to clear quite a bit faster using like a breakthrough designation, which I'll talk about a little bit. The high regulatory complexity, the average cost for regulatory is about $3 million for medical device development. And then there's high development costs anywhere from $2 to $5 million for just getting to MVP. In terms of your success as a startup and increasing investor confidence, I wanted to identify a few points to kind of emphasize why this topic is so important. The first item is that regulatory strategy really should be aligned with your IP strategy that was discussed earlier, your marketing strategy, your business model, et cetera. They go hand in hand. In terms of increasing investor confidence, there's a lot of things that a regulatory pathway opens up to you. You have the ability to early market and obtain early adoption, so you can start getting testimonials and white papers. Remember, if your medical device is not cleared or approved by the FDA, you cannot market it. And putting information on your website is considered marketing. You can block competition that was called out a little bit earlier. So if you're able to clear first, let's say through a PMA, you can set the standards on subsequent clearances. So you can set the bar quite high. That's going to require your competitors to follow suit. Market validation. So obviously, as soon as you clear your product, you can actually start marketing it. So that means you can go out, start testing your product, share with your product with prospective customers, and start doing some market validation with the actual device itself. It helps reduce your risk to investment. So it validates the cost of regulatory activities. So if I get a question at the end, what generally does it cost for a regulatory submission? It's going to depend. It's going to really depend on your product. If it's a PMA, it could be in the millions. If it's a 510K, it could be 250, 500K, somewhere around there. And when you're doing a 510K, it's going to depend on how much work you can actually do internally versus outsourcing. The ability to collect data for real world evidence. So there is kind of two schools of thought around, doing either the PMA or the 510K. If you do a 510K first, if you're able to do a 510K first, you get to market, and then you can start doing some, as I mentioned, some validation, but you can also start collecting real world evidence. So we've seen a lot of medical device manufacturers that have multiple indications, but requires a significant amount of data collection, AI being one of them, right? So having a base Me Too product allows you to get out in the market and start collecting real world evidence so that you can start focusing on your larger submission, which would be your PMA. A more innovative part of your device. And then market adoption for extended features such as AI, which I just mentioned. So high level, your FDA submission requirements. So once you determine that you're a medical device manufacturer, which I'll explain in a little bit, there's two areas you need to implement in terms of your company, in terms of process and your product, right? So you need to implement a quality management system. ISO 13485 is highly recognized. That are your processes, tools, and procedures, et cetera, that actually provide your design controls for the development of your product. The design history file, that's primarily what's going to be in your FDA submission. And so your design history file is all of the technical specifications of your product specs, your architecture, your design, all of your testing, et cetera. These are the two main elements that should be in place as a medical device manufacturer. This is just a summary of what's included in a QMS, very high level. So you have document control processes, risk management. supplier controls, training, etc. From a design history file, it's everywhere from planning, development, verification, even validating your tools, and usability, which is human factors. And then from a software perspective, you have an additional set of documentation. So if you're developing an instrument and software, the software part of the documentation could be equivalent, if not more, to the documentation required for the instrument. The software aspects of the regulation as it relates to SAMD and SIMD, which was spoke about earlier. There's a lot of emphasis now on cybersecurity, and cybersecurity currently to date does not make any distinction of the risk of the device. That is unfortunate. We hope to see that changing, but the barrier is quite high, especially related around cybersecurity. So when I go over this, there's two categories. There's a pre-market and there's a post-market. I'm going to talk about pre-market. So pre-market is everything you need to have in place to market your product. That includes putting your product on your website, right? That's considered a marketing activity. Post-market is everything that needs to be put in place to distribute and sell, right? So once you get pre-market approval, you can start marketing your product, but there's aspects of the FDA, which includes registration to be able to sell and distribute your product. So there's two pieces. The registration is looking at your quality management system primarily. Your FDA submission or your approval or clearance is looking at the technical specifications and the testing of your device. FDA process. So this is kind of a high level timeline specific to 510K. I'm going to talk a little bit the differences between 510K and PMA and some of the other regulatory pathways, but this kind of gives you an idea. The thing here is it might seem pretty fast, but when you start looking at the data, it actually takes longer than what's depicted here. And there's a couple reasons for that. So the more sound your submission is going to be, the more clear it's going to be, the less feedback you're going to get from the FDA. So when you do your submission, FDA will provide significant feedback and then they stop the clock, right? So when they stop the clock, they're able to meet these metrics, but the calendar time is still rolling and it's highly dependent upon your responsiveness to the FDA. And so just kind of keep that in mind. The more better upfront work that you do, the faster you can speed up this process. So there is some aspect of it that is in your control. We've seen customers come in and try to submit just to get FDA feedback. I do not recommend that. It just slows things down. And once you get the feedback, it's binding. And they're going to dig into areas, if it's a kind of a messy submission, into areas that you wouldn't want them to dig in otherwise. So it's better to put your best foot forward and do it right the first time so that you can move ahead and get clearance. The other way is it's going to be iterative and kind of waste time and resources, even the resources of the FDA. So these are things I'd like you to consider when developing your medical device. These are things that should be defined up front, but can be refined and iteratively against. So intended use, this is going to depend on your application. Your intended use is going to basically be used as input to define your device classifications. There's 3 FDA device classifications, 1, 2, and 3. And then your submission type, which I'll talk about in a second. You have your FDA PMA, 510K de novo, and breakthrough. And then you have a software level concern, which has changed now to software documentation, which is major and minor. Basic and enhanced. And then you have the software safety classification that's recognized by EU, but also by the FDA that's followed quite a bit. So it's just a really well-known guidance related to, or safety standard related to software. During intended use, this is really important. It's really essential that you get it done right up front because this drives everything. But we do see it change, and we do FDA submissions. Basically, our clients submit to us and we review on behalf of the FDA. At the very end, we're always tweaking the intended use and we're always changing the labeling. And the reason for that is generally the intended use tends to be a little bit more broad than what the submitter is able to prove. Right. And so what you want to do is draft it in such a way that you can actually provide evidence of efficacy and safety. That's the main thing FDA is going to look for. If you can't prove it, if you haven't tested it, doesn't matter if your competitor's doing it, it will not get cleared. And so when you look at these questions for your intended use statement, you want to consider the following: what your software system does or what it's meant to do, who will be using the system and why will they be using it, is your software system intended for the use of diagnosis of disease or other conditions, and the cure, mitigation, treatment, or prevention of disease? So number 3 is what determines if your product is a medical device. And so when you look at that statement or that question number 3, consider a toothbrush as a class 1 device. right? So it is a regulated device. How regulated depends on the risk of the device. And then you want to describe the disease or condition. A lot of our clients kind of get stuck in the middle where they're trying to define their medical device as a wellness application so they don't have to be regulated. Just be very careful with that. There is guidance on whether your device is a wellness device, and it's not too many devices fall into that are really new and novel, right? And so I'm expecting a lot of things that you guys are working on are probably in the space of where it's potentially regulated. So the device classifications, so there's three. So there's a class 1 that's general controls with and without exemptions. There's class 2 with special controls with and without exemptions. And then there's class 3 general controls and pre-market approval. So you can read here that the classification is risk-based. So class 1 is the lowest risk. It's exempt, but you still need to register with the FDA and you still need to show some level of design controls, but it is considered exempt, which means it does not need to go through a clearance or approval process with the FDA, but the FDA can come and audit you if they choose to, and you do have to make sure you're managing complaints and you're instituting proper and solid design controls. Class 2, this is the most common submission type. It's where a lot of customers want to be because the class 3 is quite expensive. So the difference between a class 3 and class 2 submission for just the FDA fees is $100,000. And then the effort to get it cleared includes clinical studies where the class 2 doesn't require any clinical studies. This is the FDA legal definition of the device classification. So most devices can be classified by finding matching description of Title 21 of CFR. So that's the regulation. And there's over 70,000 distinct device types. I believe with the previous presentation, there were some conversations around basically how to classify your device by looking at the FDA database. So there's no real direct way of doing that other than doing some research. You need to check what your competitors are doing, check the FDA website, access these links to see if similar products have been cleared by the FDA. That will help you to know whether your pathway is going to be class 3 or class 2 or class 1, right? So let's say, for example, you're researching your product and you find very clearly multiple devices are class 1, and you read then the legal description of that device and you fit within that legal description, then most likely you're class 1. So regulatory pathways. So there's multiple options here. There's the 𝗬𝗃, which is not necessarily a regulatory pathway. It's part of the regulatory process, which I'll explain. There's the PMA, there's the 510K, and the 510K has special, abbreviated, and third party. There's the breakthrough designation, exempt, and de novo. So breakthrough is a fast track option that can apply to PMA, 510K, or de novo. So basically FDA has classified devices in certain areas as they seem as important or immediate need in the healthcare space. I think opioids at one point was a big deal. And so they classified that as breakthrough designation. So there's other devices that allows you to have more of a concierge type relationship with the FDA, and they help you through the process, but it applies to any of these submission types. 𝗬𝗃. So 𝗬𝗃 is a meeting with the FDA before you actually do your submission, or if you're looking for breakthrough or de novo designation. So this is a free meeting with the FDA. There's some guidance here on how to actually conduct the meeting, but it's really helpful for submissions that are PMAs. That's very important. If you're de novo, that's also very important. 510K is not so much, with the exception if you have you're in a gray area where you could be a PMA, but you're looking at it, you are finding predicates, but your technology maybe is slightly different. And you want to meet with the FDA to agree on your testing strategy. This is really important because you get buy-in pre-submission on the aspects of your submission that take the most time and is the most expensive, right? And so if you have that and you want some sanity checks with the FDA, then it's good to meet with them early, and they'll give you a meeting. They'll actually do a virtual meeting, or they'll do a written response to your submission request. PMA. So this is the most expensive pathway, but this applies to a lot of devices that don't have a predicate and that are highly innovative. So the pre-market approval is the process of scientific and regulatory review to evaluate the safety and efficacy of class 3 devices. So here, just note, class 3 devices are those that support or sustain human life, are substantial importance in preventing impairment of human health, or which may present a potential unreasonable risk, injury, or illness. 510K means someone has already gone through the process of a PMA or de novo, and now there's a product code, there's a predicate. The FDA recognizes that there's an example that you can use for your submission. So this is when you actually can use a previously cleared device, and you just basically need to show equivalency. It doesn't have to be identical. You have to just show that you're equivalent. And it does not require clinical data, although you may need to submit clinical data to support your efficacy claims. It's not required. 3P 510K is a fast track for the 510K. It's going through a third-party review organization. We're a third-party review organization, so instead of submitting the FDA, you could submit to us. The last 2 clearances we did less than 60 days. So we're pretty fast, and you get kind of, I want to say, more responsiveness and a secured team and locked-in deadline when you use a third party. It's more predictable. Breakthrough designation, as I mentioned, that's voluntary, so that applies to all the other pathways. So these are areas in which FDA considers basically a need, and it's usually around life-threatening or debilitating diseases or conditions. There's an actual list, but also if you want to see if you can get breakthrough designation, there's a process for that, and it's through the QSub process. Exempt, this is a decent category because when you're exempt, you don't have to wait for the approval process, but you do have to register with the FDA and you have to have your quality management system in place. Some of your exempt products will require special testing. So the reason why FDA allows for exempt for class 1 is because they're low risk, but for class 2, they start exempting devices that have a known test methodology. So it's lower risk. FDA knows how to test it. There's standards to test against. And so as long as you're testing against the standards, you can be part of that exempt category if your product falls under that category. De novo, this is probably the most, I would say, most complicated one to define. Is basically if you're not class 1 or class 2 and you go through PMA and you're lower risk than what FDA identifies as the high risk class 3 devices, then they'll put you in this de novo category. And so the requirements are a little bit looser than, or lighter, I would say, than the PMA, but they're much more stringent than the 510K. So it's kind of like this unknown area between the PMA and the 510K. It's like, we're not a 510K, but we're not that high risk to be considered, you know, and PMA. And what we're seeing is a lot of de novos around the AI part, right? Because we have common devices, and then a lot of medical device innovators are adding on top of existing sensing technology and then deriving new clinical insights. And so that's putting it in a different category that hasn't been, you know, experienced or seen before by the FDA. Registration. So I mentioned before you actually can start selling your device, you do need to register with the FDA regardless of your device classification, regardless if you're exempt. There are different rules if you're class 2 or class 1 exempt or non-exempt, special controls, et cetera. So make sure you research what is applicable to your device. And this is required to be done annually. There's a fee associated with it. I don't want to say it's minimal because I know you guys are all startups, but I mean, don't quote me on it. It's about maybe $3,000 a year or something like that to register. So it's not as significant as the submission cost, but it's a cost nonetheless. This list here is a lot of the guidances at the high level. So if you're like, okay, I have a medical device, I believe I'm class 2 or higher, what do I need to do and put in place? I would start here. So all of these guidances, I would call them kind of parent guidances, and underneath they reference other guidances, other nuances, right? So this list is very important. This is what at a minimal you need to put in place. And this is what you'll hear time and time again when you talk to experts about quality management system is ISO 13485. Well, that's what that means. And here's 2 more. So part 11 for electronic signatures, and then cybersecurity. So they're not all of them. I have a device we're working on today, and we probably have a list of 30 standards that we have to comply with. So again, these are the parent standards. And once you start here, it at least can help direct you to the other subsequent standards you need to understand. Okay, so I know that was a lot, but I do want to open it up for questions, and I know we are behind time as well. So Just want to be conscious of that. Yes. Yes, Miss. Hi, Kay.
Hi, Shawnnah. Thank you for all of the information today. I had a question with regards to usability. When is it recommended, and what does it mean if my product, my product type or my product code is on the FDA's list of high priority devices?
Okay, so those are two questions. So I'll start with the usability one first. And then remind me if I forget about the second one. So usability is kind of tricky because it's not required. But then, so when you do your eStar, there's a form. When you do your FDA submissions, called an eStar form. It's not really called out. So there's no spot for it, but FDA looks for it all the time. And so usability is primarily like if you're doing, well, if you're doing a PMA, it's required, right? So when you do a PMA, you want to basically show that your product is free from any sort of misuse. That includes the instrument and the software. So you're looking at like usability, but hazards associated with usability. Like I'll give you an example, like let's say, I don't know, this is a simple example, but let's say you have a button next to the save and the delete are right next to each other, and the likelihood of someone hitting the delete versus the save is high, and then they lose patient information. And then that's a hazard because they've just gotten tested and maybe they have cancer or something, right? And so that's a trivial example of that. But then what you want to do is you want to make sure that there's provisions or controls in place to prevent a misuse condition from happening. And so when you look at your product, you're going to be looking at the critical tasks that could actually trigger a safety event. And then you want to protect against misuse associated with that. For class 2, it's a little bit trickier because if your predicate did usability, FDA almost expects it. But if your usability or the design, let's say, of your device is very similar to the predicate, then you can justify not doing it. So everything's kind of risk-based. So it is an area of grayness, which I would recommend getting consulting advice on, or going to FDA with the pre-sub if you plan on not doing usability. And the reason being is because if FDA comes back and says usability is necessary, it's like 6 to 9 months and minimal $100,000, if not more, depending on the sample size that they want you to collect. And sometimes they'll have recommendations of like 200 patients, right? And so just kind of keep that in mind. Did that answer your question, Kay?
Second question.
Okay.
What if the product code or product type is on the high priority list for the FDA? So for example, if I'm working on an infusion pump, I see that infusion pump and some associated product codes are on that list. What does that mean?
In terms of special controls or in terms of?
In terms of usability.
Oh, in terms of usability. So FDA, certain product codes, I didn't mention here, but some product codes have actually their own standards that actually derive from the existing standards. So for example, fusion pumps, for example, will have its own safety guidance around usability that FDA is going to expect to comply with. And so when you understand where your device falls in, that's when I mentioned special controls. Those are the extra things that FDA wants you to consider. Give you an example with, we talked about infusion pumps, but ventilators, for example, aren't class 3, even though they're life sustaining. The reason why they're not class 3 is because they got kind of grandfathered in, but there's tons of standards, safety standards that are super stringent around the criticality and safety and all of that around ventilation that basically make it a class 3. It just happens to be a class 2. So just because you're class 2 doesn't necessarily mean there isn't certain additional rigor that needs to be done. And then that's going to be identified by your product code, and FDA will call out what those standards are and what they expect. Yes. Hi.
Let's say I have a class 2 device and I'm targeting the 510K pathway. And we're currently in the sandbox phase where we're designing and prototyping. What's the timing for bringing on the controls? Is it too early to start when you're sandboxing, or?
I would say it's never too early to start, but if you're really iterating, let's say, on your requirements and your design, like in a high volume fashion, and you still really don't have your intended use locked down, then you may not want to institute design controls, but you don't want to wait so far that everything's a reverse engineering activity, because then it defeats the purpose of the process. The whole point of the process is to make sure you're building safe and effective devices. And so many times we'll see startups come to us to reverse engineer, and they're like, we're ready to submit next month. Reverse engineering can take 9 months, sometimes 18 months. And a lot of times we have to change their design, right? So you want to keep that in mind when you're building out your system, is really once you start getting to the point where you actually want to send it out for users, I would backtrack that by a few months to make sure you have a sound baseline. Because when you submit to the FDA, some people like to submit the final version, which you should submit to the FDA, but you can do iterative development and benchmark testing as long as you show that your testing from your previous device configuration to your what you're going to market is actually equivalent, right? So if you're doing a test activity that's very important and expensive and you need it for your submission, I would recommend having design controls in place prior to that.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Great presentation. I have two-part question.
Okay.
One is, when do you start or when do you recommend your client to start considering CPT code as they are considering regulatory strategy and submission? And the second one is about a combination product where device and the software is combined, and how do you suggest approach?
Yeah, sure. So in terms of the CPT code, they kind of go hand in hand, because if you're doing a PMA, you may not have a CPT code. You may not. That doesn't mean it's an absolute, but it's more innovative. That's why a lot of the digital health, especially digital therapies, it wasn't done before. So there was no actual reimbursement standard set. So that can be quite expensive, and you do have to do clinical testing for that. So if you're thinking about your reimbursement strategy and your regulatory strategy at the same time, then what you could do is couple the studies together to achieve the two different purposes, but when in one study, because those studies are going to be really expensive. So it's important to understand that up front. And that's why I was saying, like, a lot of times you'll tweak your intended use, because maybe if you change it slightly, your product's still kind of the same, but the application of it might be different. Your technology might still be the same. Then you might find another avenue for reimbursement. It might not be your gold standard of what you ultimately wanted, but then you can at least get there, because most medical device products are based on reimbursement. No one pays out of pocket for these tests or these diagnostics, right? If it's not reimbursable, it's really hard to get someone to pay for it. And then with FDA 510K, usually if there's a 510K, there's already a product code because someone's done this legwork before, but it's important just to research so you know where your CPT code actually lives. Can you repeat your second question?
The second question is your consideration for combination products like device and the software or AI.
Yeah. So this has to do with a few things. So one could be kind of your regulatory strategy, whether the combined device you're using someone else's device, then obviously their indications stay with them, and then you add on your additional indications. So you have to show the integration testing between you and that device, but you're not responsible for the clearance of the device unless you're altering it, which most likely you can't do, hopefully, right? And so that would be in that scenario. But if you have hardware and software, it's not necessarily a combined product unless it falls under more than one product code. So if it's still the same intended use, it doesn't matter if it's an instrument or software. You can find a predicate that may do more stuff in the electronics versus the actual application that you can still use for your 510K. So where it becomes combination a lot of times is like clinical therapeutics like CDX, where you have an actual diagnostic, and the diagnostic is then recommending a treatment. Those are class 3 devices. That's usually what FDA is calling combination devices. But with electronics and software, it's really just how it falls under the intended use. And then based on how your software is designed, the guidances that I listed will cover software. So then you'll know how much rigor you need to put in the software versus the electromechanics of the instrument.
Thank you.
You're welcome.